Monday. A light breeze swept through the gray stone walkways behind Silver Rest, the largest funeral complex in the state of Ohio, where even death was wrapped in velvet and frosted glass. On paper, the place was a symbol of humane farewells. In reality, no one really wanted the night shift here. Not because of ghosts, but because the silence at Silver Rest smelled like old antibiotics, carried a dull yellow light, and echoed faint noises through the air ducts that no one could quite tell were real sounds or just the mind playing tricks after standing too long beside the cold bodies. At 10:02 p.m., an old man appeared at the back door. He wore a faded khaki coat and held a moss-green canvas bag with frayed handles. His face was expressionless, pale gray eyes nearly matching the color of his beard and hair. He didn't knock. He didn't step in. He simply stood and waited. After a moment, the door swung open. A night shift employee named Rick, in a uniform jacket with the Silver Rest logo, looked him over from head to toe. "You're applying for the night shift, janitor position," the man replied. His voice was raspy, not soft, not booming. "Call me George." Rick looked him over again, then casually opened the door wider. "All right, George. Maintenance left an old set of uniforms. If you're not afraid of ghosts, welcome to Silver Rest." George didn't smile. He stepped in, and his worn leather shoes let out a faint creak on the vinyl flooring. No one knew those shoes had once walked through the funeral of a sitting state governor, or that this man, just 15 years ago, had personally signed off on the final design plans for this entire complex, from curtain colors to the height of the columbarium walls. Now he quietly slipped into a uniform whose logo threads had already frayed. On the left chest was a white name tag, George, Night Cleaning Staff. Behind the building was Room 9, the storage area for unclaimed bodies. George didn't ask questions, didn't request an easier task. When Rick said, "Room 9 doesn't get touched much, but it still needs cleaning once a week," George simply nodded. Only one man paused to look at him more closely, a fellow night shift worker named Wallace, a silver-haired, slightly hunched man who used to be Silver Rest systems engineer. He stood by the coffee machine, watching George's reflection in the mirrored panel, then said softly, "This place used to whisper, now it screams." George stopped folding his cleaning tools. He didn't say anything, but he looked into the mirror. For a moment, two old men, both survivors of winters where morality quietly died, recognized each other without speaking a word. Room 9 sat at the far end of the west hallway. Its door bore a small wooden plaque. Restricted access, internal only. No flowers, no carpet, no ambient music like in the main halls. Just a row of industrial freezers, 3 long stainless steel tables, and a filing cabinet with a rusted iron lock. George didn't hesitate. He slipped on his gloves and began wiping each table surface, each hinge joint. A small metal ring fell from the crack between 2 tiles. He picked it up, slipped it into his shirt pocket. No questions, no return attempts. He just noted it in a worn leather notebook with blue ink. Night 1, found, object unregistered. Room 9, west wall, lower seam. Near midnight, as he was finishing his tasks and packing away supplies, slow footsteps approached from behind. It was Wallace. "You ever done work like this before?" Wallace asked, holding a cup of plain black coffee. George glanced around the cold room, then replied, "I once built this place." Wallace didn't flinch. He gave a slight nod and sat down on a plastic chair, gazing at the empty space between freezer doors. "My wife used to be a farewell attendant here. Volunteer. Every time someone came in without family, she'd light a candle for them. Pray. Lay her hand on their forehead, even if no one asked her to." George didn't answer, but his eyes closed slowly for a few seconds. "People like her," Wallace continued. "They'd never get hired today. The system's got no room for kindness that acts on its own. Everything's got to come with a voucher." With proof, George opened his notebook, turned to a blank page, wrote the first line beneath the flickering fluorescent light. She remembered the forgotten. This place forgot her back. At the end of his first shift, George didn't head straight home. He stood in front of the main farewell chamber, the one where his wife's funeral had been held. 15 years ago, a plaque reading "Community Farewell Room" had been installed there, dedicated to giving dignified send-offs to those with no attendees, featuring white flowers, candlelight, and a proper goodbye. Now that plaque was gone, replaced by a sleek metal panel with a QR code for package service bookings. George placed his hand on the brick wall. In the mortar there was still a narrow groove, and in that groove a faintly etched line remained. All farewells matter, M.E. The initials of his late wife, M.E. He touched it gently, as if honoring an old promise never spoken aloud, then turned away. The night was only beginning, and the truth had yet to be seen, not even by those who still thought they ran this place. Tuesday. A light rain began falling at 9:15 p.m., just enough for the concrete around Silver Rest's service wing to reflect the amber glow of the sodium lights. George arrived 30 minutes before his shift. He didn't say why. He simply sat in the ground floor staff lounge, reading a yellowed newspaper and sipping lukewarm tea from an old thermos. Rick didn't notice. He was busy reviewing the report for the upcoming cremation batch scheduled for Friday. On that list were 3 names marked in red, not for medical reasons, but for being unclaimed. Wallace passed by, nodded at George, and lit a cigarette. The smell of old tobacco, not strong but steeped in memory. They said nothing, just sat in silence like men who'd survived many winters of the soul, and understood that some conversations didn't need voices to begin. At exactly 10 p.m., George changed into his uniform and walked straight toward room 9. The path from the lounge passed 3 zones: the reception wing, the ash room, and admin 2. At each, he moved slowly, as if measuring each step so as not to disturb the already overly quiet space. The hallway walls remained a pale gray, decorated with frame prints of hydrangeas and a well-known quote, "Dignity is the language of farewell." But George knew. The artwork was replaced every 2 years, not for aesthetics, but to cover the stress cracks from the building's aging HVAC system. Room 9 was at the far end, a door with no handle, just a keypad entry. George didn't have the code, but he had watched the day before. He'd seen Rick type a 4-digit sequence with muscle memory and quietly memorized it. He pressed 1973, Rick's birth year perhaps. The door clicked open with a dry mechanical sound. Room 9 had no flowers, no soft lighting. The fluorescent tube lights on the ceiling flickered for a few seconds before stabilizing. The air smelled sharply of ammonia and industrial disinfectant. Beneath the harsh white light, 3 steel tables were aligned in parallel, each holding a white body bag. 2 of them had no tags. The third carried a small slip of paper. Walter S., pending cremation, no next of kin. George didn't immediately start cleaning. Instead, he walked to the filing cabinet in the far right corner. The lock was rusted but intact. He ran a hand across the hinge, stiff but aged. A light layer of dust covered the top, a sign no one had touched it recently. George noted in his journal, "Cabinet untouched, evidence of non-rotation." To the right of the cabinet was an old brick wall. If one looked closely, 1 brick stood out, slightly smaller by about half an inch. George tilted his head, touched the brick's edge. It wasn't loose, but there were signs it had once been pried open. He stepped back, mentally reconstructing the wall's layout from the 2008 blueprint. He had once proposed this room to house memory boxes, small compartments for mementos of the deceased, even for those with no next of kin. That plan was shelved by finance in 2011, deemed cost ineffective. George turned and began cleaning as usual. But this wasn't surface wiping. He meticulously scrubbed the metal grooves, the caster wheels under the gurneys. In the process, he found a folded piece of paper wedged in a floor crack. He used tweezers to retrieve it. A handwritten note, trembling script. "If you find this, please forgive me. I did what I could. M." He folded it, placed it in his pocket next to the leather journal. No words, no reaction. But his spine straightened slightly. The lights continued to flicker. At 11:15, a voice called from the hallway. "George, you still in there?" It was Miguel. He held a bouquet of white flowers. George opened the door and saw Miguel standing there, breathing lightly, hands slightly trembling from the cold night. "I know no one pays much attention to this place, but I think everyone deserves a flower, even the nameless." George didn't ask why, didn't speak. He simply nodded and opened the door wider. Miguel stepped in, placing the bouquet on an empty table. The soft scent spread in the cold air. He bowed his head, not in any official rite, just a quiet act of presence. After a few seconds, George asked softly, "What's your name?" "Miguel Santos. Been here since last year. My wife passed giving birth. I know what it's like to say goodbye with no one beside you." George looked at Miguel with a gaze heavy with meaning. In those eyes, he didn't just see grief. He saw something the system couldn't train: compassion. Miguel left after a few minutes, saying nothing more. Before leaving, he left a small note. "Walter S. used to be a teacher. I looked up the records at his old school. No one came to claim him, but I think he deserves to be known as someone who mattered." George folded the note carefully, placed it beside the previous one marked M. At 11:45, he pulled up a chair and sat next to the steel table, stared at the bag marked Walter S. Not afraid, not sad, just one question echoed in his mind. Since when did a farewell require paperwork to be allowed? He opened his journal, wrote a new line. Night 2, 3 bodies, 2 nameless, 1 teacher, all forgotten. Before turning off the lights, he glanced back at room 9 one last time, as if listening to see if the place had anything left to whisper. But that night, it didn't whisper. It was silent, like someone who had once screamed into the void, then gave up. Wednesday. There was no rain, but the ground outside Silver Rest still held moisture. The street lamp near the West Service entrance flickered repeatedly, as if it too was uncertain about its own existence. George arrived exactly on time. Not early, not late. The staff room door had grown used to the sound of his shoes. That familiar creak now seemed to echo differently each night, as if even the floorboards were listening, watching, holding their breath. Wallace didn't come in today. Rick passed by and sighed, "That old guy took a 3-day leave. Probably his back acting up again." George didn't respond. He was thinking about the note from M the night before, and about the white bouquet Miguel had brought. When he entered room 9, George saw a new flower on the leftmost table. This time a white carnation, not a rose. It sat in a repurposed glass jar, faintly etched with the words, Chapel 3. That was the name of the old remembrance room his wife had once designed, a place where those without family were still given a proper farewell, with candles and soft music. George sat in the chair by the wall. He didn't start cleaning right away. He carefully studied the flower jar, then opened his notebook and wrote a line. Someone still remembers Chapel 3. Memory persists. Sometime after 11 o'clock, the door opened. It was Miguel. He stepped in with a brown paper bag in hand, his expression a mix of hesitation and resolve. "I know I'm not supposed to be here long, but I brought some ginger tea. You drink that?" George nodded. He didn't say thank you, but reached out his hand to accept it. Miguel sat on the chair across from him. Between them lay an unnamed body, covered by a worn white sheet. Miguel pulled out another bouquet from the bag, this time white roses, tied with coarse twine. "I don't know her real name, but I found a hospital file. It said Jane D. Female, age unknown, no family, no visitors. But the autopsy noted a healed cesarean scar, which means she was once a mother." He paused. "I think someone should be here to send her off." George set down the tea, quietly stood up, took off his gloves and walked to the steel table. He didn't touch the body. He simply placed his hand on the metal edge and bowed his head. Miguel did the same. No one spoke. No music played. But in that moment, the cold room felt like a quiet service, without incense, without mourning garments, but filled with the real presence of respect. When the silent farewell ended, Miguel took out a folded sheet of paper. "I'm compiling a list of the nameless here, recording every name I can trace. Maybe I'll make a memorial plaque one day, if no one stops me." George didn't ask why Miguel was doing that. He simply nodded, a silent agreement between those who understand that some things don't need permission, only courage. Miguel bowed slightly and turned to leave. Just before the door closed, he murmured, "If the day ever comes when they try to erase everything like Chapel 3, at least I've written their names somewhere. Even if it's just on paper." The door clicked shut. George watched the space Miguel had just left, as though something precious had passed by. A small gust of human kindness slipping through the cracks of a cold policy. He turned back, pulled out his notebook, and wrote, "Tonight, a mother was remembered, and a name tried to stay." He sat again beside the table, reached into his shirt pocket and pulled out the previous day's note from Miguel, folded it together with the new one about Jane D., then placed both inside the flap of his leather-bound notebook. George knew better than anyone that those small notes might one day outlast every meeting, every financial report, even the bronze plaques hanging brightly in the corridors. As he left room 9 to clean the hallway near the ash storage wing, he passed a narrow window into the secondary stockroom. Inside, he saw the beam of a flashlight aimed at the wall. Miguel, still on duty, was using his phone light to illuminate a blank surface. His hand pressed a yellow sticky note to the wall. Next to it, in faint handwriting, were the words, "I remember you." George paused, watching for a long moment. Long enough for a memory to return. His wife, 15 years ago, holding a similar notebook, standing in Chapel 3, bowing before a body no one came for, and whispering, "No one leaves without a name." That night, George returned to the staff room earlier than usual. He didn't sleep. He sat down and wrote in his notebook everything that had happened. Not as a technical log, but for the first time, as a journal entry. Miguel, a young face, but eyes that have seen too much. Doesn't wait for permission to do what's right. He didn't learn this from me, but I'm learning it again from him. Near 4 a.m., he set his pen down, turned off the light. Before leaving the room, he passed by the coffee machine and placed a small packet of ginger tea on the table. No note, no signature. Only those who truly notice would recognize it as a thank you. And those who truly see would understand. Tonight, room 9 wasn't just a place for the dead. It became a space where memory was being stitched back together through white flowers, small slips of paper, and the quiet presence of two men, generations apart, but standing together for those long forgotten. Thursday. The sky above Silver Rest was covered by a pale lead-colored haze, stretching endlessly like the untouched memories lingering in room 9. George stepped through the side gate with his usual gait, carrying nothing but a leather notebook and a pair of worn-out fabric gloves. From a distance, Rick was speaking with a new office staffer, a young blonde woman named Maddie. He pointed toward the mortuary wing. "That's George's zone." "Don't ask too much. He works like a machine. Doesn't say much, but not a speck of dust on his watch." George didn't care about the comment. He had lived through enough winters to know that existence often boiled down to one word: useful. But what was occupying his mind now wasn't cleaning. It was the rusted metal file cabinet at the back of room 9, the one that had passed through his periphery countless times like a piece of forgotten furniture, until he started to ask himself, why would a place built to preserve the dead hide what they once carried with them? When he entered room 9, he locked the door quietly and turned on the main lights. The fluorescent glow spilled across the cold steel surfaces, casting his reflection faintly, like a person not yet fully recognized. He reached into his back pocket and pulled out an old keyring, not given by Rick, but left in a small wooden box by Wallace in the tech room the previous night, without explanation. Only a slip of paper had been tucked inside. "Try the bottom drawer. You'll know it when you see it." George tested each key. The fourth one gave a soft click. He opened the lowest drawer, the one few ever bothered to reach. A dry metallic groan echoed out, followed by the scent of old paper, mildewed cloth, and something strange, like a draft blown in from another world. Inside were 3 unmarked cardboard boxes and a stack of black file folders with no labels. George pulled them out one by one. Inside, items no one had claimed. A pocket watch long stopped, an old Polaroid of 2 children standing beside a church, a broken wooden comb, a small knife engraved with FD, and a calfskin Bible with the first page handwritten in blue ink. "To Daddy from Lila, Christmas 2004. George sank to the cold floor, his frail body curling slightly as if physically bowing beneath the weight of time and neglect. In his hands, these objects were no longer mere things. They were stories abruptly cut off, ripped from memory by a system he had once designed with noble intent, and which others had later operated by calculation. He opened his leather notebook, turned to a blank page and began writing line by line. Drawer 4, unregistered personal items, no tracking codes, no recipient tags, estimated 40-plus items, personal, emotional, erased. And at the bottom of the entry, begin silent inventory. For the next 2 hours, George was no longer a janitor. He didn't mop floors, didn't check pipes. He opened each folder, photographed each item using his old flip phone, documented every detail, each carving, each handwritten word, each faded bloodstain or fleck of dust. Every object was gently placed into a Ziploc bag, labeled with a note, as if he were constructing a second cemetery, not one for bodies, but one for rejected memory. At 12:45 a.m., there was a soft knock on the door. George quickly returned everything to its drawer, then opened the door. Miguel stood outside holding a stack of papers. I found a few more names. Jane D stands for Janice Demon. She used to be a librarian in Cleveland back in 1980. A police report from 2009 said she was missing. They assumed she was transferred to another hospital, but she never left. George looked at him but said nothing, gesturing for him to come in. Miguel placed the papers on the table, glanced around and lowered his voice. Do you know what's in that cabinet? George paused. I do. Miguel exhaled. They used to call it the cabinet of the taken, the place where they kept things they didn't want to return. Wallace told me once. But no one ever opened it, because if you do, you're responsible for it. You have to record everything, and that means accountability. George didn't answer. He quietly opened the drawer again, this time for Miguel to see. Under the flickering light, the forgotten relics, once deemed worthless, now demanded their presence be acknowledged. Miguel reached in and pulled out a black and white photograph. This man is my grandfather. His hand trembled. I'm not completely sure, but I've seen this photo in my mom's old album. I never thought it would be here. George nodded slowly. He said nothing. But in that moment, his gaze held no detachment, only pain, as if the system he had once built had not just erased strangers' names, but had unknowingly buried the bloodlines of people like Miguel. Both men fell silent. In the refrigerated room, something began to thaw, not ice but distance, and in its place grew an understanding that justice sometimes doesn't begin with a loud demand, but with quiet ownership. Before leaving, Miguel said, I'll come in earlier tomorrow night. I think we should make a complete list. Call it the Registry of the Forgotten. George simply nodded, then wrote in his notebook, Miguel, found photo. Lineage confirmed. This place stole more than silence. It stole roots. Near 3 a.m., George locked the drawer. But this time, he didn't just seal it with a key. He sealed it with a silent promise that every item within would one day be named again. He knew from this point forward, his role wasn't to clean surfaces. It was to return memory to its rightful place. And Room 9, the space once reserved for the nameless dead, had now become a sanctuary for the restoration of dignity, not with bells, but with resolve. Thursday, a windless evening, yet the air around Silver Rest felt heavy, like a storm was brewing from nowhere, pressing down on everything. George arrived for the night shift as usual, coat folded neatly in his arm, notebook tucked into the left pocket of his jacket. His face was unchanged, but his steps felt half a beat slower, not from age, but from thought. Rick was standing outside the staff room, voice curt. We've got a case coming in, but word is we're not taking it. George looked up. Not taking it? Rick shrugged, nonchalant. Doesn't meet the criteria. No sponsor, no insurance papers, no family contacts. Black male, early 60s, found dead in an old warehouse on the east side of Columbus. Police sent over the file, but Darla said no. She doesn't want a negative point case on the books this quarter. Too close to audit season. George said nothing, but each word Rick uttered slammed against the thin glass wall of a memory long buried. The day his wife was still alive, arguing with a branch director because they had refused a frozen homeless girl who died at a bus stop. Margaret once said, "Death doesn't require financial proof. It only asks to be seen off." He had forgotten those words. Now they returned, like a slap without sound. Around 11 p.m., the police transport van arrived with the body. A young first-time night shift worker named Evan opened the door to the side receiving bay. The body was placed on a stretcher wrapped in plastic, with no paperwork except for a small folder. Name, Rufus M. Cole, former firefighter. Later unemployed, homeless. In his coat pocket were an old ID photo, a rusted fireman's badge, and a handwritten note. Tell Lenny he was right. I shouldn't have left. Evan turned to George. Do we take him? Before George could respond, Rick appeared behind them. Put the stretcher back. We're not accepting. Darla made it clear. This one doesn't qualify under internal policy. Evan hesitated. But he served the city. There's a service record. Rick shook his head. No insurance. No family. No authorized signer. Leave it. The coroner's office will pick him up in the morning. George stood still, his hand gripping the notebook so tightly the leather edge wrinkled. He looked at the body, not with the eyes of a janitor, but with the gaze of someone who once swore that every life, however short or stray, deserved to be seen off with honor. Where's the key? George asked quietly. Rick turned. What? The cold room key. I'm placing him in there. Rick froze. George, don't do this. You're a cleaner, not authorized to handle intake. George repeated, voice low but firm. The key. Where is it? Rick stepped forward, blocking his way. This isn't your call. George stared into his eyes, not angry, not shaking, but that look, calm and unflinching, made Rick, who had stood up to plenty of supervisors before, instinctively step back. George approached the stretcher, gently pulling back the cover. The unnamed man lay still, his face at peace, the yellow ceiling light reflecting off the faded ID photo resting on his chest. George picked it up, looked at it for a moment, then placed it back gently. He wheeled the stretcher into room 9, while Rick called after him, George! You're violating protocol. I'm reporting this to Darla. The door to room 9 shut. George turned off the main light, leaving only the dim yellow lamp, one his wife once chose for quiet farewell rituals. He took a clean cloth, wiped Rufus M. Cole's face. Beneath the lined skin were traces of a man who had once worn a firefighter's helmet, once rushed into burning buildings for strangers. Miguel entered through the side door. No questions, no explanations needed. He placed a bouquet of white chrysanthemums on the table, then softly played an instrumental jazz track from his phone. I don't need to know who he was, Miguel said, only that he deserved to be heard one last time. George nodded. They stood together, two men from different generations, beside a body that had been denied by the system, overlooked by leadership, and erased by policy. But tonight, no absence was large enough to prevent a proper farewell. George wrote in his notebook, Rufus M. Cole, firefighter, forgotten, refused, but tonight, remembered. The next morning, Rick entered the staff room with a tense expression. Darla had received the report. Evan was reprimanded. George was summoned, for the first time since he began working there. But he wasn't worried. He knew what he did didn't violate ethics, only policy. And he also knew policies are written to protect finances, but ethics are meant to protect people. And last night, he chose ethics, no permission required. Friday. The Ohio sky was layered with low-hanging clouds, not heavy, but thick enough to block any sunlight from breaking through. Silver Rest operated as usual, a funeral at 10 a.m. for a wealthy businessman, followed by a live broadcast memorial for a local public figure. But no one noticed that in the back wing, the room nobody liked to visit, something had quietly begun, unapproved, unscheduled, but unstoppable. George arrived 30 minutes early. In his hands was an old wooden box. It used to be his wife's tea box. Now it carried items he had cataloged from the cabinet of the taken. Inside were carefully wrapped belongings collected by him and Miguel. A handwritten letter from a 12-year-old boy to his mother who died in a car crash, a cracked ceramic rosary, an unmarked pouch of ashes found in the secondary storeroom, and a black and white photo of a group of Asian immigrants eating rice together in a rented house in 1973. Everyone was smiling, except the person behind the camera. Miguel was already waiting in room 9. They exchanged no greetings. Both understood that tonight wasn't for talking. Tonight was for restoring dignity, through a farewell not listed in any company procedure, an unsanctioned goodbye. George laid each item on the steel table. Miguel pulled from his canvas bag an old flashlight, a bouquet of white flowers, and a small Bluetooth speaker. "There's no official funeral music," Miguel said, "so I picked this." A gentle piano melody began to play. It was the same instrumental piece George's wife used for the free memorials at Chapel 3. George recognized it by the third note. Nothing was said, but they both knew. Tonight, Chapel 3 had come back to life. Not through bricks, but through intention. The side door to room 9 was latched. Main lights off. Only the flashlight illuminated each table, each one holding an unnamed body, covered by a white cloth. Each one a life that had never been formally said goodbye to. Miguel placed his hand gently on each person and whispered, "Sarah, no one claimed you, but someone remembers you now. Raymond, a former engineer, you lost your memory, but now you are seen. Kim Lee, a mother of one, her picture was found in her wallet. Rufus, a firefighter, tonight you're honored again like a hero." George stood beside him. He didn't speak. He simply placed a hand on Miguel's shoulder after each name, nodded, then wrote in his notebook, 6 lives, 6 names, 6 stories restored. They lit small candles, not for light, but as symbols, each flame representing a person. No photos were taken, no footage recorded, or so they thought. That night, another janitor, Devon, was passing the auxiliary hallway when he noticed candlelight flickering through the door seam of room 9. Curious, he quietly recorded a short video with his phone. The clip lasted 37 seconds with no audio. Just the image of 2 men, one old, one young, bowing over 3 covered bodies. Each had a white flower laid on the chest. Under the soft candlelight, they didn't look like employees. They looked like family. The next morning, Devon uploaded the video to TikTok with a simple caption, "I thought I was alone tonight. Turns out someone was saying goodbye for real." In just 6 hours, the video passed 250,000 views. Comments poured in. "Is this real? Where is this funeral home that does this for the homeless? I want to send my mother's ashes here. Who is the older man? He looks like he's carrying all the sorrow in the world." And the most liked comment of all, "This isn't just funeral work. This is soul work." Darla saw the clip during lunch. Her face went pale. She immediately called Rick. "Who authorized this footage? Who was in that room?" Rick stammered, "I don't know for sure, but if I had to guess, probably Miguel and that old guy, George." Darla slammed her palm on the desk. "I want both of them out today. Pull the security footage. Get me the incident report. I will not let Silver Rest turn into a TikTok charity case." Rick picked up the phone to call HR, but it was too late. A second video had already been posted, this time by Miguel himself. No bodies shown, just the items from the wooden box, laid out one by one on the table. Each was labeled, "The Watch," belonged to a father who never made it home. "The Rosary," from a woman who prayed for someone she never got to meet again. "The Fireman's Badge," he saved others but was left behind. Caption, "They are not forgotten. Even if no one remembered, we will." Within 24 hours, the clip hit 1 million views. Reporters began asking, is Silver Rest secretly conducting funerals for the homeless? A local TV station called, requesting an interview with George, the man now referred to online as the quiet one with the broom. George refused. He didn't talk to reporters. He didn't defend himself to management. He just kept showing up on time, cleaning his assigned areas. And the next night, he lit candles again in room 9, not with words, not with authority, but with silent presence and action. Saturday. Strong winds swept across the southern grounds of Silver Rest, kicking up fine dust and dry maple leaves from the row of trees near the employee parking lot. The air felt stifling, not from heat, but from something internal, from the whispers behind George's back, from Rick's cautious glances, from Wallace's unusual absence, and from a staff-wide email with the subject line, "Investigation of unauthorized activities, all staff cooperation required." George knew the storm had begun, but he didn't stop, not when he had yet to fully open the cabinet of the taken. That night, George arrived even earlier than usual. Miguel was already waiting at the back door, arms full of old records he'd borrowed from the county library. Lists of the missing and unclaimed deceased from 2002 to the present. He gave a faint smile, his eyes full of quiet urgency. "Shall we begin?" George didn't speak. He nodded, unlocked room 9, and for the first time in over a decade, he dragged the old metal cabinet out of the corner. The camera system in that room had been broken since 2019. No one had bothered fixing it. Not much traffic in there, they'd said. George used the key Wallace had left for him, the one hidden behind a loose brick near the crematory, and the cabinet door clicked open, as if every silent scream of the past had just been released all at once. Inside, there weren't just 3 boxes like before. There were 7, stacked on top of one another, coated in dust and webs. Each box was marked only with a vague code, M22, FD, UN5. No files, no QR codes, no attached documents, just objects, separated from their owners, packed away and forgotten. George pulled them out one by one, laying the contents gently on the table. An unsent letter dated 2008. It began, "Dear Mom, I'm sorry I never told you the truth." A wedding ring engraved, "To Alice, with forever." A 3rd-grade notebook with crayon drawings of 2 people holding hands under the rain. A small wool scarf with a veteran's pin attached. A folded bus ticket with handwriting on the back. "This is the day I go home." Miguel couldn't hold back his tears. All of these people, they were hidden away? George nodded. No paperwork. No one came to claim them. No one asked for their things back. And more importantly, no one wanted to pay to store them. So they were left behind, unreported. Miguel sank to the floor. They didn't just lose their lives. They lost the proof they ever lived. George sat beside him and placed a hand on his shoulder. "We'll give it back to them, one by one." That night, the 2 men worked like archivists inside a sealed memory library. They made lists, took photos, labeled each item with temporary codes. Miguel pulled them out one by one, cross-referencing them with public databases, trying to match them to real people. Some matched old newspaper reports. Some were too faded to trace. But George documented every single one. At 2:20 a.m., Miguel opened the 6th box. Inside was only one item, a small red suede notebook. Inside was the original design draft for Chapel 3, the memorial room for those without family, handwritten in 2005 by Margaret Ellison, George's wife. On the first page was a quote. George said, "We can afford to care, so we must." Miguel turned to George. You're that George, aren't you?" George was silent. A heartbeat passed. Then he nodded slowly. Miguel stood frozen. "So, you're the founder of Silver Rest?" George didn't look at him. He replied, "I was the man who once believed this place could be a home for both the living and the dead. But I left, when it became just a balance sheet." Miguel rose to his feet, eyes wide, voice trembling. "Why did you come back?" George looked up slowly. "Because I thought I had failed. But the real failure was walking away." The room went still. Then Miguel said something George would never forget. "Then tonight, we're not just giving names back. We're correcting history." At 3:12 a.m., Miguel began labeling each item with a new identifier, FKP-001 through FKP-030. FKP stood for Final Kindness Project, the name Miguel came up with when George asked, "What are we calling this initiative?" Miguel smiled. "Kindness, because it doesn't need a permit." Before leaving, George reached into the last box and pulled out a photo of his wife, standing in Chapel 3, her hand resting on a homeless man's shoulder, eyes looking directly into the camera. George didn't know who had taken the photo, but he knew the look in Margaret's eyes, gentle, firm, not sad, not angry, was exactly what needed to return to this place. He turned to Miguel. "We need a new room." Miguel understood instantly. No ribbon cutting, no press release, just a door that opens for those forgotten. George nodded. "And a wall of names, a place that remembers everyone who was once erased, but has now been restored." Sunday. No more rain, but the sky remained gray, as if it were holding back tears for something that hadn't happened yet. At Silver Rest, the morning shift staff went about their work as usual. They had no idea that the night before, in room 9, a quiet ceremony had taken place. No bells, no speeches, no official plaques. But there were flowers, there was music, and there was someone watching. George and Miguel had placed 6 unidentified bodies on the tables, each one wrapped in a fresh white cloth. Resting on their chests were mementos recovered from the cabinet of the taken, the last traces of the lives they once lived. A family photo, a fragment of a letter, a rosary, a handkerchief, a handwritten poem in Spanish, and a crumpled bus ticket. George stood on one side, Miguel stood on the other. No one spoke. A soft instrumental song played in the background, the same one once used in Chapel 3, now revived like a thread stitching past to present. That boy, Liam, age 13, son of a groundskeeper at Silver Rest, was walking through the rear corridor looking for his father. He noticed the door to room 9 slightly ajar, with candlelight spilling through the crack. Liam pulled out his phone and recorded the silent memorial. He didn't fully understand what he was witnessing, but something inside told him it mattered. He filmed quietly. No narration. Just light, still faces, and the gentle gestures of 2 men bowing over the forgotten. The next morning, Liam posted the 58-second clip on Instagram. His caption read, "I saw 2 strangers saying goodbye like they knew them. It was the most human thing I've ever seen." Within 24 hours, the video went viral. Multiple platforms shared it under the hashtags Chinanachar the final goodbye, Dunoran they matter too. Who were they comments flooded in. This kid captured what our whole society forgot. Who is the older man? The way he touched that shoulder. That's not how an employee touches someone. That's someone carrying a burden. My dad died in a shelter last year. I couldn't be there to say goodbye. This clip made me feel like someone did it for me. Messages poured into Silver Rest. Someone recognized the handkerchief in the video. It once belonged to their grandmother, who passed away in 2012, unclaimed. Others said they had worked at Silver Rest in 2007 and remembered a woman named Margaret who used to host farewell services for the unnamed. A journalist from the Cleveland Times called asking to interview George. When he declined, they turned to Miguel. He hesitated, then agreed but did not share his real name. The article ran that Tuesday with the headline, "The Janitor and the Roses, Inside the Quiet Resistance at Silver Rest." The opening paragraph read, "In a place where death is priced in packages and printed on gilded brochures, 2 men are doing what the company never dared to log. They're remembering the forgotten." The piece featured 3 photos. 1. A still from Liam's video, 2 men bowing over 6 bodies covered in white. 2. An open wooden box containing personal belongings. 3. A brick wall with a small handwritten note pinned to it. They were here. Within a week, the Final Kindness Project, the name Miguel had given their effort, had become a topic of national conversation across ethics forums, funeral care communities, and faith-based networks. A priest in Texas wrote, "They're doing what God commanded, without needing a church." A black pastor in South Carolina declared, "If Silver Rest dares fire them, I'll open my church doors to every unnamed soul from this city moving forward." Silver Rest began to tremble. Shareholders received letters of protest. A group of volunteer law students offered to defend George and Miguel's employment rights. A local TV station invited George to appear on a talk show titled, "Are We Forgetting the Forgotten?" But George declined, because that night he had more important work to do. Restoring the old Chapel 3 sign, found buried in the storeroom, covered in dust. Miguel gently wiped the wooden plaque, then looked at George. "If they knew who you really were, they'd never dare fire you." George replied, "If they knew, they wouldn't dare let this continue. But then it wouldn't be me changing the system. It would be my reputation doing it." Miguel understood. He nodded. That night ended with a farewell for one more unnamed woman. In her pocket was a slip of paper, written in shaky handwriting. "My name is Elsie. I'm not a nobody." George wrote in his notebook. "Tonight, Elsie was seen. Tonight, we remembered out loud." Monday. The air in the 3rd-floor conference room of Silver Rest was thick, like a storm cloud compressed between 4 glass walls. 9 a.m. sharp, all branch and departmental executives were present. Rick, visibly tense, Darla, with lips pressed tight, and directors of finance, operations, and communications seated in rows along the long boardroom table. At the head of the room, the screen displayed the title, Critical Operations Review, Internal Ethics Breach, Unapproved Activities, Pending Disciplinary Action. No one smiled. There was no coffee. No pastries like the usual meetings. On the table before each person lay a gray dossier labeled FKP, Unofficial Activity Report. Inside, screenshots from Liam's viral video, news articles, printed TikTok clips totaling over 5 million views, and a compiled list of complaint emails from the community. Rick stood to open the meeting. As you all know, images and actions deemed unofficial farewells conducted on our premises have gone viral beyond expectation. The fallout is now affecting our brand and the trust of our premium clientele. He paused. 2 employees are currently under scrutiny. George, the night janitor, and Miguel Santos, a cold storage support worker. We're recommending immediate suspension pending internal investigation. Darla cut in. I say we terminate. Silver Rest is a professional organization, not a sentimental charity. They accessed restricted areas without clearance, handled unregistered belongings, and worst of all, broadcasted the narrative uncontrollably. We're now exposed to potential lawsuits if we don't act decisively. Several nodded in agreement. Others said nothing, but their eyes were uneasy. Suddenly the door opened. No announcement, no knock. An older man walked in. He wore the same faded gray janitor uniform, but his hair was neatly combed, posture upright, and his eyes, no longer avoiding anyone, were clear and unwavering. George. The room fell silent, silent enough to hear the HVAC spinning. Rick stammered, You're not authorized to be in here. George stepped forward slowly and stopped at the head of the table. He didn't sit, didn't ask permission. He just spoke, clear, firm. I think you should know who's standing in front of you before you make any decisions. Darla scoffed, half mocking. Who are you? A janitor trying to get famous off a few emotional videos? George looked directly at her. Then calmly he pulled from his pocket an old ID badge. Golden yellow, the text still legible. George Ellison, founder, chief architect, Silver Rest Foundation. He placed it on the table. Next, he laid down a copy of the original founding document for Chapel 3, signed by himself, Margaret Ellison, and the 3 original board members. Finally, he unfolded a typed draft titled Initial Design Philosophy. Silver Rest is not a place to bury bodies. It is where the dignity of the forgotten is held as sacred. No one spoke. Rick turned pale. A finance director flipped through her copy to verify. Darla leaned back in her chair. Some had heard the name George Ellison before, a legendary founder who once transformed funeral services into a human experience, but they assumed he had died or disappeared after Margaret's passing. George scanned the room, then spoke again, his voice low but resonant, each word hitting like a wooden gavel. You're sitting in a room I designed, at a table I selected the wood for, beneath a ceiling that once held portraits of those we sent off, free of charge, no proof of income, no next of kin required. He pointed to the screen. Now you sit here, outraged that a child captured a moment of human dignity, and call it a PR crisis? Darla snapped. You step down. You hold no authority in this system anymore. George didn't flinch. I have the authority of a human being, and the only one here who still remembers why this place was built. He turned to the whiteboard, picked up a marker, and wrote in bold letters. Who were they? Then turned back to the room. Can any of you name 3 people who were laid to rest in room 9 last week? No? None of you? Then stop pretending you're protecting a legacy. You're protecting profit, and forgetting that what made Silver Rest famous is exactly what you're trying to erase. Miguel entered the room. No one stopped him. He stood beside George and laid a folder on the table, a file listing 28 names now identified, once labeled unclaimed. Each entry included a photo, a personal item, and excerpts from handwritten letters. George continued, I'm not asking for forgiveness. I'm asking for clarity. It's time we stop and ask, what are we actually doing here? And what are we turning this final place of farewell into? Silence. Then the head of operations, who had worked at Silver Rest since George's era, spoke up. I remember Chapel 3. I brought my father there once. No one asked for documents. They only asked, what would give you peace? Then the communications director stood. I'm not deleting the clips. We shouldn't erase the most beautiful thing that's happened here in years. George nodded. I don't want my title back. I only ask for 3 things. Reopen Chapel 3, restore every archived record, and establish an independent internal ethics committee so we can begin again. He looked directly at Darla. And if anyone here believes that's a threat to the company's reputation, the door is right there. No one's forcing you to stay. Darla stood, ready to protest, but every eye in the room had turned to George. No one looked at her as a leader anymore. George opened his notebook, wrote one final line. The day I was welcomed back was not with a title, but with consensus. Wednesday, just 2 days after the fateful boardroom meeting, the atmosphere at Silver Rest had completely changed. The administrative department canceled all scheduled internal audits to make room for something never before listed in any official operations manual. The Audit of the Dead, a program of restorative honor. George did not return to his old executive office. He declined the nameplate desk, turned down the express elevator access, and even refused the proposal to reinstate his title as founder. He chose instead to work from a small room next to the secondary storeroom, a former janitorial closet. Miguel rearranged a table and hung a handwritten sign on the wall that read, We are not looking for the dead. We are looking for the dignity buried with them. That morning, George gathered a 5-person team, none of them senior staff, a night guard, a warehouse assistant, a retired librarian, Wallace, recently returned after 3 days' absence, and himself. No one from finance, no oversight from upper management. George simply said, if what we're seeking is the truth, then truth doesn't require a title to be found. The team was assigned to review all records from 2006 onward, the year Silver Rest began operations. They re-examined all unclaimed remains, incomplete case files, and personal belongings without official inventory. Every item, every page, every faded sticky note was reviewed by hand, no software. Within 48 hours, they uncovered 92 files marked non-essential had been erased from the official system over the past 10 years. Over 300 personal items had never been recorded or cataloged. 17 cremations were authorized prematurely without sufficient time to verify next of kin. All signed off by Darla or her direct reports. A recovered internal email from 2018 showed Darla instructing, no need to fully document cases with no payment capacity. Prioritize warehouse clearance to increase intake volume. As the scattered data began fitting together like broken shards of a mosaic, George called for an internal hearing, open to all Silver Rest employees. That Friday at 6 p.m., the main funeral hall, once reserved only for VIP services, was used for a different purpose, to speak truths no one had ever dared speak aloud. George stepped up to the wooden podium, no suit, no microphone. In his hand was the same worn leather notebook. He opened to a middle page and read aloud to the nearly 80 employees seated before him. April 7th, I found a wedding ring engraved, to Alice, with forever. No one ever asked about it. No one ever recorded it. But that day we kept it. Today I call it an unpaid debt to human dignity. He looked up. We cannot build a reputation on the things we quietly discard. Miguel then stepped forward holding a freshly printed file. The Registry of the Forgotten. The list contained 91 names, people once labeled unclaimed, now re-identified. Each name was accompanied by a photo or artifact displayed along the hall side walls. As staff walked past, some wept. Some paused silently and laid their hands on the photos. One day shift worker murmured, I buried the 3rd person on this list. I just learned his name was Benjamin. George closed the hearing with one sentence. From this day forward, no one leaves this place unnamed. 3 days later, Darla was permanently suspended. Rick resigned before deeper investigation could begin. Mid-level managers who had signed off on record deletions were required to attend a 3-month funeral ethics education program. starting with a real-time tour of Room 9. Silver Rest issued an official statement. We apologize, not only to those we failed to name, but to the staff who were left to see them off in silence. Miguel was appointed program director of the Final Kindness Project, granted full access to internal archives. He was tasked with relaunching Chapel 3 and establishing the Wall of Names, redesigned from Margaret Ellison's original hand-drawn blueprints. George held no official role, but he was there every night, checking each cold drawer, adjusting each memorial candle, and recording small stories into his notebook. One evening, Miguel asked him, "When will you stop?" George replied, "When there's no one left who needs me to remember for them." Sunday, the last day of the month. The Ohio sky opened into a soft blue, sunlight thin like silk, bright enough to see dust drifting in the air, gentle enough not to sting the eyes. Today, Silver Rest held no funerals, per the request for a first-of-its-kind event in the organization's history. The inauguration of the Wall of Names. There were no ad campaigns, no press coverage. But by early morning, people began arriving. None invited, all drawn. A 78-year-old man came with a worn wooden suitcase that once belonged to his brother, missing since 2009. A black woman stood beside her daughter, holding a portrait of her father, once recorded as John Doe number 54. A Puerto Rican man clutched an old radio and whispered, "My grandmother heard her last song on this. I'm bringing it back with her name." They stood together in the back courtyard of Silver Rest, once just a bare patch of land near the technical wing. Today it had become the resting place of a 12-meter-long wall, matte black steel, etched with the names recovered from the Registry of the Forgotten. No photo frames, no plastic flowers, just names, engraved in thin, upright typeface, a design reminiscent of old Chapel 3, once chosen by Margaret. Beneath each name, a small QR code, scannable to display a photo or memory tied to the person, compiled by Miguel and the Final Kindness Project team. George stood a few steps back from the wall, leather notebook in hand. He didn't speak. He didn't like microphones. Never needed a spotlight. But Miguel stepped forward on behalf of the team, standing before more than 200 silent attendees. His voice wasn't loud, but it was clear. We didn't build this wall so people would cry. We built it so they would remember. Because no one deserves to vanish from memory simply because they had no family, no property, or no paperwork. This is not a charity list. This is a justice list. Applause didn't thunder, but it was steady and sincere. George opened his notebook, turned to the final blank page. From his pocket, he pulled Margaret's old blue fountain pen and wrote, "Today, 114 people got their names back. We remembered, so they stayed." A young boy stepped forward and touched the wall. His eyes stopped at a name. Lillian Grace Vega. He turned to George. "Who was she?" George knelt down slightly, replying gently, "Someone no one asked about for 9 years. But today you just helped her exist again." People began forming a line to scan the QR codes. Some knelt. Some stood silently, placing their hands on the names. No one gave speeches, but everyone was allowed to cry, if they needed to. Wallace stood at the end of the line. He placed an old photo on the memorial base, one of himself and Margaret. Then he turned and walked away. No one called him back, because everyone understood. Sometimes goodbyes need their own silence. A group of high school students from Cleveland arrived with 20 sketch portraits, interpretations of the once unnamed, now named, drawn from Final Kindness Project descriptions. A girl named Sophia taped one to a nearby wooden panel. The caption read, "You don't need a face to be remembered. You just need someone to believe you mattered." At the end of the day, Miguel stood beside George and handed him a printed letter of gratitude. "You should read this. It's from the family of Walter S., the first person you gave a name back to." George folded the letter, didn't open it. He said, "I'll keep it, but I'm not reading it, because I didn't do it for a thank you." Miguel smiled. "Then why did you do it?" George turned to the wall. "Because everyone deserves someone to stand beside them, even just for a minute, and say, 'I see you.'" That night, George stayed late. He stopped by room 9, now renovated into the remembering room. No more metal tables, no more chemical smells. Instead, soft wood floors, warm lights, a fabric armchair in the center, and an electric piano in the corner. Miguel brought it in, saying, "You never know. Someone might need to play the final song for someone someday." George sat down, opened his notebook, and wrote the final line. "This wall is not an end. It's a beginning, not just for them, but for us, the ones who finally chose to look." Then he closed the notebook, gently, like a quiet farewell to those who had just been named back into the world from silence. There was no farewell, no press conference, no ribbon cutting or closing speech from a CEO. Just a quiet Friday morning in late autumn, when golden leaves began to gather along the back walkway of the Silver Rest building. On the third floor, an administrative staff member received a small package. No return address, no recipient listed, only one handwritten line: "To room 9 for the ones who stayed behind." The package was sealed with red wax, the kind used in another century. No twine, no tape, just an imprint of 3 interlocking rings. Miguel was the one who opened it. Inside was a brass key, old, heavy, its edges worn smooth, and a folded note written in blue ink. The first line read, "This is the last key I still held. Everything else is now where it belongs." Below that, the final message: "Success is not what they remember you for. Kindness is." No signature, none needed. That day, George Ellison did not show up for the night shift. No goodbye note, no email, no resignation form. When Miguel checked the security footage, it simply showed George leaving the memorial wing at 4:03 a.m. His shadow stretched under the soft yellow light, not rushed, not lingering. Just a man who had placed the final piece of a puzzle and quietly stepped away. Silver Rest carried on, but not the same. Every week, a small memorial service took place in the remembering room, where students, relatives, or even strangers came to place flowers and say a name that had once been lost. Once a 9-year-old stood in front of the name Robert W. and whispered, "I don't know who you are, but you're not nameless anymore." The Final Kindness Project became an independent nonprofit, supported by donors across the United States. Miguel was no longer cold storage assistant. He became the national coordinator, overseeing a 14-state network, partnering with funeral homes, hospitals, and correctional facilities to recover and restore the records of unclaimed deaths. They had 17 full-time volunteers and over 600 memory contributors, people willing to offer a story, a photo, a fragment, just to give back a name. They called it Work of the Quiet. At Silver Rest, a second wall began to form, not for names but for last words. Regrets, unsent letters, notes never delivered. It was called the Whisper Wall. Each time a message was posted, someone lit a candle. One day, a 3-year-old sat on her father's shoulders and pointed to the wall. "Who wrote those words?" she asked. Her father replied, "People no one listened to, but now the world hears them." Miguel kept the old brass key in his shirt pocket over his heart. Every time he placed his hand there, it calmed him. He didn't know where George was. No one did. Some said he'd moved to a small town in northern Wisconsin. Others believed he was helping a rural funeral home in Georgia. Some thought he wasn't anywhere specific at all, that he was just out there listening. Whatever the truth, no one called him CEO anymore. In the organization's records, George Ellison was listed as the first witness. 1 year after the Wall of Names had been unveiled, Silver Rest hosted a live stream anniversary. No celebrities, no performances. Just a video feed from the remembering room showing 4 children writing letters with colored pencils. One girl said, "Today I'm writing a letter to someone named Lillian, even though I don't know her. But I think someone should tell her that she was remembered." At the end of the video, the screen faded to black and displayed one line: "If you believe every name deserves a home, come build the wall with us." Maybe you've never heard of George Ellison. Maybe you've never stepped into a funeral home. Maybe you think kindness has no place in this world anymore. But if this story made you pause, for even 1 minute, to think about someone who's been forgotten, then you've already become part of the Final Kindness Project. Leave a comment if you've ever lost someone and never got to say goodbye. And don't forget to like and subscribe, because every week we'll share a story that reminds you of the one thing that matters most, that every soul deserves to be called by name.